I'm incredibly pleased to have our guest speaker today, Nathaniel Daw. He's both a luminary in the field and someone I've known for a long time. We were just reminiscing. Actually, I remember the first time we met was when you were interviewing as a prospective grad student at a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. The restaurant may or may not still be there. It may or may not still sometimes appear on some of my slides as an instance of the Chinese restaurant process, which some of you might remember back when people used to build Bayesian models of cognition, before they did interpretable automatic discovery of code models. A history that Nathaniel and I both share very much of trying to understand the mind and the brain as a certain kind of rational creature, a certain kind of rational agent that forms beliefs and makes decisions, in some way approximating what we might call expected value decision making. This isn't, I think, the way Nathaniel characterizes his research. If you read his bio, he says he studies how people learn from trial and error and how they make decisions and all this. But I think if you look over the whole span of his career, he's maybe done more than anyone that I know, certainly more than anyone in my generation, to span across the whole MAR levels of analysis, like the computational theory, the algorithmic level, the neural level, in his own work, including doing experiments with neuroimaging, with building algorithmic level models of cognition, and really also deep theory, and connecting the levels specifically in the area of decision making, which I think more and more is recognized as really just, that's the point of having a brain, is to make the right decisions and to try to understand how brains make decisions and learn how to make better decisions from maybe not always making the best ones, and understanding what is the mechanistic, functional, and computational basis of that. I think Nathaniel has done more than anyone in our joint generation to advance the study of that. And I often hold that up, like when I'm teaching in my class, which some of you who are taking the cognitive core just saw, as like, this continues to be one of the frontiers of crossing all the levels of analysis in the study of decision making. And I think you will see the latest stages of that here in ways that also, another thing that Nathaniel has exemplified in his work, which I think many of us aspire to here and look to his work as a great example, is crossing not only the levels of analysis of the brain, but between natural intelligence and artificial intelligence, including drawing on insights from the study of animal intelligence to make more interesting, maybe efficient machine learning algorithms, and taking some of whatever the frontier of today's AI and machine learning, whatever that is, to use that to advance our understanding of the computations in the brain. And I think you will see all of that on display here. So without further ado, let's hear from Nathaniel.
Thanks for that, Josh. It's really fun to be back here and see so many old friends from so long ago, and talk to many new students as well. It's been really fun. So I was actually recently here. It seemed like pretty recently, sort of talking about the main thrust of my research that Josh sort of mentioned on sort of judicious deliberation and sort of in the context of decision making. So I thought today I would actually talk about a little bit of a side project. And it's really, some of it's really new, and so the somewhat more the journey than the destination, let's say. But it represents a project that I've been working on in my sort of side gig at DeepMind, particularly with Kim Stackenfeld and Kevin Miller. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to discuss with you all today under the auspices of this particular program. Okay, so this, of course, is a figure of famous AI models, plotted as the amount of computation believed to be used to compute them, to train them against publication date, to the extent that they were published. And it actually ends in 2024. The model that does some of the work I'm going to talk about at the end of this talk was from 2025, so it's still about a year old, but this trend has continued. Why is it plotted this way? Of course, because part of the big deep learning explosion was the sort of recognition of these scaling laws, that if you could sort of put a score on something a neural net could do, then you could sort of reliably run that score up by adding more data, more compute, or basically more data or more compute. That has really, more than anything, kind of driven the field, of course, as we all know, And it's had kind of a weird effect, certainly in computer science. So there's this famous essay by Rich Sutton, a luminary in reinforcement learning, who calls this the bitter lesson. And it's a very kind of poignant, almost sad essay in which he basically says, he's devoted his whole life to thinking hard about intelligent computation, and it's kind of a fool's game because all you need to do is sort of turn Moore's law on more crank and you'll get past whatever he's figured out. And so the bitter lesson is actually that just scaling really beats everything. And I think a lot of people have taken that very seriously. I mean, Rich is an inspiration to all of us. So this sort of, what I wanted to talk about today is in a very small way how we can sort of apply this type of thinking in the context of kinds of problems I've worked on in cognitive science. In particular, I want to talk about a problem I've worked on for a really long time, actually hadn't worked on for a while. This is a task that I published in 2006 that we've sort of recently returned to. So one of the sort of simplest possible cases is sort of trial and error reinforcement learning, in this case in humans. And the task is very simple. People have to choose between 4 options, here represented by 4 colored slot machines, for which they receive variable or changing over time payoffs. So for instance, green is better at first on average, and blue is better later. They're taking a Gaussian random walk. The actual payoffs are themselves stochastic around these means. So here's the most deterministic subject from 2026. You can sort of see what he's doing. This is the choices he made and the payoffs he got. So he chooses green, becomes unhappy with it, and chooses red, tries it out, comes back and switches to yellow, and so on. So you can sort of see this kind of learning and adjustment, and most people are a little more dynamic than this person, but that gives you a feel kind of what the data are. And starting around that time, and really continuing till now, although often with more elaborate tasks and animals and so on, there's been a really long program of kind of fitting trial-by-trial learning models drawn from computational reinforcement learning to the choices in this type of task. And this has been important for a bunch of reasons. One is that these models kind of relate to sort of hypothesized neural mechanisms like reward prediction errors and what people think dopamine does. That in turn means by like estimating these models on behavior, you can estimate latent variables like trial-by-trial value expectancies and prediction errors that you can then use to study signals in the brain, like dopamine recordings. There's been a ton of that. And there's been a lot of interest also in kind of individual differences in these types of behaviors, exposing sort of parameters that might be affected in disorders or by various sorts of causal treatments, Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's medication and so on. As I said, there's a program of these sort of classic models that use this sort of error-driven incremental learning. And they've been very constrained, sort of a long history of them, and they're pretty well supported. But over the years, there's been a lot of sort of epicycles and sort of new whistles added to them and so on. So every grad student sort of comes up with a new variant, a slightly different task, and a new sort of gradient ascent by graduate student, right, sort of over the space of these models. And it's sort of become a little unwieldy at this point, but there's sort of a core there. So for the purpose of today, I went and looked up actual MATLAB code from 2005 that we had used to fit this data. And since we're going to look at programs written by computers later, I thought I'd actually go through this. This just loops over, this is a very typical model of this sort. I'm happy to say it looks pretty similar to what people are using now. Loops over the choices. This is the sort of core thing that's being optimized. This is the log probability of the choice the person made given the current model's current beliefs about the values. It, at every step, updates that value according to a prediction error, the difference between the payoff it got and the choice it predicted, with some free parameter that's a learning rate. And the other thing that's sort of very typical in these models is it turns out on top of this reward learning, people are sort of sticky, or they have a sort of autocorrelation of their choices over and above the reward, the part that's explained by reward time series. And so this model, as is typical, sort of keeps track of averages, running averages of what was chosen as well, and regresses that on the choices as well. So it's got a couple free parameters, and that's basically a sort of very typical model. Okay, so why am I talking about this in 2026? A couple things. One is we wanted to have a sort of domain that we could work on to sort of try some new methods out that we understood. But the other is actually there's still, questions about this. One is that while I think there's a pretty good case that these kinds of processes are seen in animals, there's been a kind of a long-standing feeling that this probably isn't the right model of what people are actually doing. That there's probably something more kind of working memory-ish and explicit that people are actually doing in this type of task, and it's sort of correlated with incremental running averages and prediction errors and so on, but that's probably not really the mechanism that's being used. But we don't really have the right class of models, I think, notwithstanding people trying to figure out what the correct model is. And the other thing that has come to be sort of clear that we hadn't really thought about classically in this work was that people do a lot of what might be thought of as meta-learning or sort of adjustment to the task statistics. That part of what they're learning as they do this task, particularly a short one like this in human and not a long one in rats where they do it every day, is that they're sort of adjusting to the statistics of the task. They learn that, how quickly they change and what levels of payoffs they should expect and so on. So there's a whole other layer of learning that pretty much neglected, which is probably an important part of what's going on. And of course, what we really want to know, if we want to know what's going on in the brain, is learning is really about maintaining some running summary of what you've seen in the past. What is that, right? So this model keeps track of 4 numbers. That might not be one for each slot machine. That might not be the right thing. Okay, so let's try to do this sort of bitter lesson on this. Let's get more data and use more flexible models and a lot more compute, sort of Google scale compute, and see what we can do. And again, this is a sort of high bar here, and also we sort of understand this domain, and that's why we're doing it. We're not expecting to discover anything earth-shattering, but it's sort of something we can sort of wrap our teeth around and try out new methods on. Okay, so I'm going to present actually 2 studies that take 2 approaches to this problem. And I should say there's been already a sort of program of work basically trying to do this, trying to fit these kinds of models with more data and using something like recurrent neural networks especially. And the argument has been, even in animals, but especially in humans, we're sort of missing out on some of the variance in the data, like we don't have the right class of models. The problem with the current neural networks, of course, is that they're just sort of black boxes, and so they're showing there's some systematicity there, but they're not really telling you what we're missing. And so we have this tension between sort of the flexibility of the model class and the interpretability of what we get out of it when we estimate it on people's choices. And so one approach is, again, is RNNs, which are telling us that we're missing something, but it's not really clear what. So people, including us, have played around with sort of smaller, constrained kind of neural net models, like ones with 1 or 2 hidden units, to see if we can just sort of visualize the dynamics that way. This is work from Marcelo Matar's group. But still, it hasn't been super illuminating, I think. And so we thought we'd try something else, which is sort of hybrid models that hybridize neural networks and algebraic parts to try to produce more interpretable ensembles. And so that's the first project I'm going to present. And the second one is switching to a class of models that's more expressive but hopefully readable by human beings, which is just Python programs, right? So the problem with that, of course, is unlike neural networks, they're not differentiable, so it takes a lot more technology to fit them or deduce them, induce them from behavior. And in my initial experiments with this, before getting sort of hooked up with DeepMind, we found that interpretability was actually still a problem. So we had a study with Tom Griffiths and Carlos Correa, where he was sort of inducing searching over lambda calculus programs. And I have to say, you would get this thing, and this is like 2 lines, right? And I would spend half an hour staring at it, and I could not understand, even though the whole point is to induce a understandable program, it's hard to read the lambda calculus. And so we ended up doing things like making graphs of states of the program and trying to understand those. Today, what we're going to do in 2026, LLMs understand the literature. They know how to write code, how to put comments in it, and how to explain it to you. And so we can search over programs that are actually readable in a programming language we understand it. So we're going to see if that works any better. Okay, so that's the game. So here we go. So again, we can start with sort of this idea of sort of hybrid RNNs. This is work led by Maria Eckstein. So the inspiration for this study actually, again, came from Tom Griffith's lab. So he's very strongly tried to make the same point that I'm making here, that the future of psychology is scaling up data. And he's looked at domains that are sort of really worked over in psychology and argued that if you look more carefully with more flexible models, we've been missing something all along. This paper was about prospect theory, sort of simple decisions under risk. And he did lots and lots of decisions that are visualized here in a sort of two-dimensional embedding. And what he did was he fit the sort of classic expected utility kind of algebraic models, but with the sort of key functions in them, like the utility function, the probability weighting function, replaced by multi-layer perceptrons. So you had the algebraic form of the whole class of models, but you could use kind of big data to visualize and be maximally flexible about the sort of key functions within that class of models, and you compare different classes of models as well. So this study was a big inspiration to us, and we thought, let's try this for learning. Learning is, of course, much more complicated, right, because it's about, again, maintaining state over time. So it's not obvious this is going to work, but that's sort of what we set out to do, was to apply this approach in the context of learning. And so what Maria did was collected a big data set, again, on this simple bandit task from 2006, 500,000 trials, more than 500,000 trials, almost 1,000 subjects. And she sort of combed through the literature and came up with a sort of classic RL model, very similar to the one I showed you, but a little bit more developed, as there have been 20 years since, that fit the best among the sort of classic prediction error models. And what she expresses is sort of cross-validated holdout accuracy on choices. So this is saying, so 60% of the thing the subject chose could be predicted with, on average, 60% probability, which doesn't sound great, but is sort of typical in this area. Whereas in RNN, if you just fit, given the scale of data, you can fit a large RNN or a medium RNN to the data and see how well that can do. And of course, you can do a lot of cross-validation and so on to control for overfitting. And it turns out it gets up to like 67% or something, right? So it actually picks up a lot more structure. By the scale of this thing, this is a lot. Like these graduate students doing PhDs might go up by 1 or 2, so 7 is a lot. And so we're missing something. And so what is it? So she tried to do the Peterson et al. Thing of taking the algebraic model and replacing the sort of key mappings, in this case, the sort of the prediction error update, where you map, where you take a reward, a previous prediction and a reward, and output a new prediction, and also the analogous thing for the action, using MLPs. And surprisingly, that did nothing. So it didn't improve at all relative to sort of the hand-constructed model. And so that's a little bit unfortunate, because the whole idea here is, let's just take the classic model and rip out the parts and replace them with MLPs where we could, and that didn't work. So we can also look inside in the same way you could visualize the utility function, so you can visualize the value update. So this is the sort of algebraic one. It says if I expect something that's the color of the rainbow here and I get some reward, I output a new Q value that's sort of a new prediction of reward, an updated prediction, which by the definition of the learning rule is linear in the difference, right? So it looks like this sort of set of parallel lines. If you look at what the MLP learns, It's almost exactly the same thing. So there's a little bit of kind of fanning out. So it behaves a little bit differently for small numbers than large numbers. I think this is real, but it doesn't really have much of a consequence with respect to fitting the data. Okay. So I think the first thing to say is actually this was maybe a little disappointing, but it's also a result in the sense that this is, in some sense, a representation of an entire class of models, right? And there's sort of all of the models that kind of have this algebraic form with any kind of update rule in them that depends on the particular variables with this sort of computation graph, right? So in a sense, we kind of ruled out all such models in one step as not being what we need to explain the remaining variance in the data. And maybe the key feature that I would identify as being the problem is that these models don't, the RNN has a memory. The only memory these models have is their own decision variables, right? So these variables here, these parts of the model are not recurrent. So these variables here are sort of doing double duty. They're the logits that are being regressed on the choices. They're representing the actual, how much the model wants to choose each option at each time step. And they're also the entirety of what it remembers about what it learns and takes forward about previous trials. So there's sort of pressure on them to do two different things. That's sort of a characteristic of these types of models, but it's clearly not right. I will spare you the remaining exercise, or much of it. So at this point, what you can do is sort of try different architectures that have constraints in them, right, that aren't just the sort of very vanilla generic RNN, but have a memory, and try to find one that does as well as the vanilla RNN, but has some constraints in it that actually either leave you with something you can plot that's interpretable, or sort of bite with respect to suggesting constraints on the computation. And so, one version of this paper had like a sort of periodic table of possible different variations of sort of these model architectures. And this is one that I think is probably the most informative that we found. And I'll unpack kind of how it works in a minute, but it does as well as the vanilla RNN. And again, it has some constraints to it, right? It does have recurrent memory, but there's some other things it doesn't do, as we'll discuss. So two things, or one thing is really important. It separates a network that handles the reward history and a network that handles the choice history. So it does have recurrent networks that are keeping track of the time series of rewards it's gotten, but don't know which choice it made for those, and another recurrent network that keeps track of the time series of actions it's taken. And those are required to put out a number to the corresponding sort of table entry in the decision variables. That's channeled based on which action it chose, but the network itself doesn't know that. So this separation sort of segregates the latent state as something that knows about reward history and something that knows about action history, but don't talk to each other. And this is interesting in part because my co-author, Kevin Miller, has long argued that this is how we should think about the organization of the striatum in the brain, and that there really is a separation between the sort of habit modules that are involved only in keeping track of things you like to do and reward learning, which is in this kind of reinforcement learning sense, that's separate. I always, to be honest, was pretty skeptical about that, and this isn't proof of that, but it is at least consistent with the possibility that you can do as well as you can do explaining choices while separating these two things with a sort of Chinese wall, right? So that's sort of interesting. The other thing that's interesting is, as I said, this network gets to know about lagged rewards, but it doesn't know which action you chose. So its job is to take in a reward and spit out a decision variable, which is a transformed version of that reward. It can transform it in light of the time series of recent rewards, but it can't do anything like prediction errors, because it doesn't, it's sort of got a learning rate of 1 in the sense that something just gets copied into the slot in the box, and it doesn't know about the reward history specific to the option that was chosen. So it's sort of a contextualized memorizer. It just copies the reward. There's a whole bunch of structure in the action module too, which I won't talk about, but we're sort of more interested in the learning about rewards for today. Okay, so that's a sort of different way of thinking about how learning might work. It's more about sort of memorizing, keeping track of 4 numbers, and then those numbers are sort of contextualized by the state of the network. So it's got this kind of feel of being kind of more working memory-ish, perhaps, at least to kind of have resonance with that. Okay, so I'm gonna say a little bit more very quickly. We can also sort of look inside the network and try to visualize some stuff. It's not ideal because the network doesn't kind of have the algebraic structure we're looking for, and it's got these sort of complicated recurrent subnetworks, but we can at least take a look. So remember before I plotted the Q-value update in terms of the previous reward and the output Q-value. As I said, we don't really have that here. We take in a reward and we spit out a Q-value, but we spit it out depending on the state of this recurrent network. So I could plot that with respect to other things like principal components of that network. So here's the first principal component of that network, and what you see is, depending on the sort of activity state of that whole network, the reward value that gets spit out is sort of sigmoidally transformed. It's either kind of sloppy or sharp, and that's going to depend on the network's memory of previous rewards. And it turns out if you make the same plot with respect to other principal components of the state, it has other transforms, like it moves it up or down. Again, it's doing some kind of contextualization, so adaptive contextualization of the remembered value. It's sort of squashing it and shifting it, and then that's serving as a decision variable for choices. These principal components, in turn, we can try to figure out where they come from. So one thing we can do is just regress them on lagged events. And so one way of thinking about what the memory is doing is it's sort of filtering previous rewards, because it just gets a time series of previous rewards. And what we indeed see if you plot sort of lagged regressions of previous rewards onto these principal components is that many of them represent sort of filters over reward history, like running averages of long-term reward or differences between long-term reward recently versus later. And in turn, different dimensions of the network state seem to be sensitive to sort of different timescales of reward history. So there's a sort of very rich representation of sort of reward statistics that's sort of shifting and scaling the decision variables of the network. But they're being sort of just memorized. Okay, so that's about as far as we can get with this approach. So we were able to sort of rule out the sort of classic model structure for this type of data set, getting something that looks a little bit more like working memory, suggests a sort of factored latent state that had been proposed before, but I didn't believe, and emphasizes this kind of slower kind of within task adaptation to the reward statistics, sort of meta-learning-ish. This isn't really the right task to study meta-learning, so what we're doing now in this sort of program is looking at data sets where people do lots of different task variants where the statistics change, and we can actually study, can we produce a single learning rule that adapts to all of them. I should also say this was very much not, despite the title of my talk, automated model discovery. Like, this was an incredible amount of work trying to figure out what's going on and try different networks. And so the next half of the talk, we're going to try to ask LLMs to do more of the work for us, and also hopefully give us something that we can make more sense of. Good. Okay, this is the second part. So this is another study with the DeepMind group, led by Kevin and Kim and Pablo, and the follow-up. I actually talked mostly about the follow-up data, which is led by Daniel Kazenberg. This is an ICML paper reporting sort of earlier versions of the stuff I'm going to show you. but the stuff I'm going to show you is a little newer. So what we'd like to do is kind of the same thing, but we'd like to search, instead of over these hybrid RNNs, we'd like to search over Python programs, not dissimilar from the MATLAB program I showed you at the beginning, but of course we don't use MATLAB in 2026. That's how you know it was a 20-year-old program. In particular, we're using a sort of general purpose model harness that has been published by DeepMind and used to sort of run it inside DeepMind as a service. It's called Alpha Evolve is the branding. And the way it works is it's basically, the heart of it is an LLM. It's prompted with a long set of instructions and example programs with scores. And it says, here's a program, here's a couple other programs with scores. This is the current program we'd like to improve. Can you give me a patch to make it better? And it gives you back a patch. You get a new program. You score that. That goes into a big database. And then it works a sort of magic about recombining those programs in a kind of evolutionary algorithm to try to run up the score. So what we do then is take those programs, fit them to the same types of data sets I've been talking about, again, with sort of multiple levels of cross-validation, and just repeat. So the scoring function itself is going to involve fitting free parameters like a learning rate or a softmax temperature or whatever the model wants to use in its Python program. So the scoring function has its own sort of model fitting, and then that's cross-validated. And that score is given back to the database, and the database is given to the LLM to write programs. And then we do this a lot. So I think what I'm going to show you, each step is about 100,000 steps where sort of new programs are produced. That takes about a day on a lot of GPUs and CPUs. So it's an unusual sort of computational mix. There's GPUs for the LLMs, and there's CPUs for the scoring, and they've got to sort of talk to each other. So it's sort of complicated engineering, and this is why this is a project we can do at DeepMind and not at Princeton. And we run this on 5 large data sets, sort of similar to the one I talked about, including the one I talked about, and 4 others, different species, similar tasks. All of them have kind of what we think of as strong kind of human-written baselines because they've been studied for a long time. Okay, so let's see how this works. So let me just give you a kind of big picture of some things I've learned in trying to do this. It turned out, I mentioned some things about why this is hard to compute, and there's a lot of engineering going on here, but one reason it's incredibly hard is the LLMs are really good at cheating, so they will figure out some way to make the program crash and return some infinity, and then that'll run up the score, and you'll find that out because the logs will say all the programs are now returning infinity, and you've got to figure out how it's doing it, and so there's a whole bunch of kind of making this robust enough to run for 100,000 iterations, at scale. The other thing we learned is that the underlying model matters a lot. So when we started this project, it was on sort of one of these pre-Gemini models called CodePoet, or internally called CodePoet, and it just didn't work. And then they switched, I think, to the first version of Gemini. And just overnight, it was writing programs like it understood the literature. Like it's got meaningful variable names and sort of it clearly knows about prediction errors and like it's just sort of complying with the conventional literature. And I think I view this mostly, we'll talk about this as a good thing because it helps part of the reason that LLMs are more useful than search over lambda calculus is because they can be explained to me in a way I can understand, and it's in communication with the literature. So the fact that the model is already sort of pre-trained on the entirety of human knowledge, in some sense is a good thing, right? If this is going to sort of do what my grad student would do, my grad student would go read the papers too, right? And then we switched to Gemini 2.5, and also to this Alpha Evolve, which works with patches instead of making the program be rewritten at every cycle. And what we'll see, and I'll show you an example of this, it got too good. It wrote incredibly complex programs. So there's limitations of the earlier models were helping us keep the programs manageable. And what we started to get are 600 lines of highly commented and very readable code, but it was 600 lines. And so I think this brought us to the problem of, LLMs are really good at running up scores, and this is obviously a general point about all of AI, but you really have to figure out what you want the model to optimize for you, and we didn't really want to optimize fit to data only, so we needed to sort of bring in interpretability as well and balance that, and so that's the story I'm going to tell you. The other problem is, great, we've got 100,000 programs, like I can't sit down and read all of them, right? So what are we going to do? How can we sort of organize the space of programs or distill any information from them? But it works. So the first thing to say is, here's 100,000 steps, about a day of computation. You go from chance to similar performance. This is the human data set again as the RNN. Here's showing you that it's similar performance as the RNN. So it does the thing. And this is true across all the data sets. And some of them, it actually beats the RNN. And in the case of the monkeys, we're in a sort of more limited data situation. The RNNs actually don't have enough data to do a good job. So, 0 is the baseline human-written program. You'll see the y-axes on this graph, if you can see them, are very different. The human baseline is much relatively worse compared to the various animal baselines, perhaps for reasons like I've already discussed. But qualitatively, the model discovery, by a Python program can basically match the RNNs with whatever there is left to find in the data, which is sometimes not much. Okay, and also potentially do better than RNNs in cases. It seems like it's more data efficient. Okay, so what's the catch? As I said, the catch is, and this is my favorite slide, it's just unbelievable. So there's 300 or 500 lines, depending on, we repeated this several times. And if you look at this, it totally makes sense. Every line has variable names that are understandable, and it's got a comment saying what it's doing, and it's not lying, it's not hallucinating. I can understand any piece of it, but I can't understand 600 lines at once, and I'm the domain expert that's paid to read these things and figure out what to do, and I'm actually suicidal. And so, and this is only a tiny, I just randomly took a piece of the program. This is, maybe 20 lines or something. And I think what you can see, I don't have my reading glasses on, but it's got a reward prediction error at the top, and then it does this kind of evolutionary algorithm thing where it copies the same code and it mutates it, and so you have sort of partly overlapping pieces, and they really do all contribute a little bit, but it's not going to kind of work as theory because it's sort of putting all, it ran up the score, but not in a way that we can make any sense of. So we tried using sort of automatic ablations, and that doesn't work because the pieces aren't all that independent. So it's a real mess, and we sort of had to go a little bit back to the drawing board. And so what we did next was say, okay, let's try to optimize for readability or simplicity or something. And we tried lots of different ways of assessing understandability, and we even used LLMs to judge that, and it turned out relatively simple things worked surprisingly well. So there's something called Halstead complexity, which is sort of a classic notion from software engineering that goes back to the 70s, I think. And it basically works with the parse tree of the program and counts symbols and it's sort of meant to it's sort of a little more complicated than counting lines, but it's like how many operations are there and how much memory does it use and those kinds of things. And the argument is it's supposed to be a sort of rough measure of how long it would take a human to understand it, so that's exactly what we need. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a second stage optimization where we start with models, a set of models from the first stage, and we're going to do this actually with under different constraints, but we ask it to reduce the Halstead effort now, make the program simpler, while maintaining some constraint on goodness of fit, right? So we're going to get, I think, 95, 75, or 50% of the sort of space between the handwritten model and the best discovered model in terms of goodness of fit. It doesn't necessarily actually go down to 50%, but it's allowed to, and it wants to make the model as simple as it can. We do that for another 100,000 steps. You can see performance fit drops a little bit. The model is able to make things a lot simpler. This is a log scale, actually, so it's a lot simpler. And we have one more step where we use an LLM to rewrite the resulting 3 programs with more comments to be more readable, just to really make it more understandable. We programmatically verify that doesn't change the program itself, and the whole thing is still written by a computer. And here's the kind of thing you see. So we have a sort of Pareto frontier. This is fit, right? This is Halstead effort in the log space of understandability. The plus was the handwritten program. And so the original programs that were found without any Halstead constraint are sort of these 3, and then these 3, and these 3 are the other resulting programs. So you can see that you can get things that are way simpler, or a bit simpler than the human program, or equal to it, but fit pretty much almost as well as the full program, right? And these I can work with, right? So this, for instance, this is sort of the meat part of one of the 50% programs. And I'm not gonna, you really could read this, I could read this. The only part I've left out is the part that sort of brings in the parameters. And then what it does, it's written in JAX, so it's a little bit different from MATLAB. It has to run a single trial instead of a loop over trials. But basically, it's got a prediction error-driven update, which maybe I should look over here. It's got a prediction error update at the top, an update. It's got the action piece similar to the one I showed you. In fact, it's incredibly similar to the program I showed you at the beginning of the talk, except that it fits like way better. And part of the lesson of this was how much better it can fit. Well, the first time I look at this, I'm like, this really looks like the same program. And it's not. There's small differences, and the small differences matter. And so there's sort of subtle ideas that turn out to make a difference. So there's really 2 things in this program, and if you look at the slightly more complicated programs, you find a few more. But basically, the main thing, there's something about the action history, but there's also, which affects the sort of particular dynamics of sort of bouts in the task, but the learning rule, so the error-driven learning rule, the learning rate is actually 1 for the chosen action, so it's more like, again, kind of storing the received reward like the previous model, but all of the other options are also updated by the same prediction error. That is, they're all sort of nudged towards the reward the subject got. And so what that does, it's kind of a funny way to think about it, it's not really comparing, it's copying the reward that it got, and it's comparing it to basically a kind of slower running average of all the other rewards, which is sort of what we saw, it's sort of a simplified version of what we saw in the other neural network as well. So it again is kind of more like this kind of working memory thing where it's basically asking itself, is this reward good enough relative to the previous rewards I got? And the weird thing about that is that includes the previous rewards. It's mostly during about the previous rewards on the arm the subject chose. So there's sort of a ratchet effect where if I choose an option over and over again, and its value is going down, that's actually bringing up the value of the things it's being compared to, and you're going to actually leave it. And that maybe that makes sense, but anyway, that's what's happening, and we hadn't sort of appreciated that in the data. So we were able to go back and do things like, this isn't, we're trying to figure out what the word is. This is not a prediction since the model fit the data, but it was sort of features of the data we didn't realize. So this is a sort of lagged regression of reward history to choices. And so the most recent reward, it makes you want to stay on the same option again. And then all the other previous rewards, even if you choose the same option over and over again, all the other previous rewards you got there actually want to drive you away. So it's not like I got lots of rewards on an option and the average of all those is making me want to stay. It's the comparison between the ones I got now and the ones I got before. And kind of weirdly, but this comes out of the algebra, basically it doesn't matter, previous rewards after the most recent step count against you about the same amount whether or not you got it from the option you chose or the option you didn't. So all of this, I think, sort of makes much more, I mean, I'm not sure you understood all that, and fair enough, we could talk about it offline, but it basically makes totally digestible the kind of thing I think we were sort of struggling to understand in the recurrent network model. It's a pretty simple learning rule. It's just very different from the one we had in mind. And again, it has this kind of feel of kind of local adjustment to sort of long-term rewards and sort of memorization, sort of working memory. And and yet, it looks almost like the program I wrote. So there we are. So we have, again, very sort of similar kind of results for the animal data sets. We can make, much simpler programs that do better than the handwritten programs. And if you look at them, and again, another way of visualizing that, this is the RNN, these are all the different simplified programs, and we're basically not giving up that much of the advantage even in the vastly simplified programs, which are really easy to read. But the overall experience, at least of reading the most simple ones and the next most simple ones, which is what we found to be the most useful, again, it's actually really surprising how close they come to the kinds of things that everybody had worked really hard on for a long time, and yet they do systematically better. But there are these sort of subtle changes that turn out to matter a lot. So there's sort of two general themes. I'm not going to present all of the different animals, but just give you one more feel, and then I'll wrap up. A lot of them, I've sort of already mentioned this, often kind of refactor the hidden state into different parts. This in turn might suggest neural predictions that we can go back and study in the brain whether these things really are separate. And there's one case where I think that's actually turning out to be true already. So this is the monkey version of the bandit test, which is data that came from Vinny Costa at Emory. And this is a task that adds an additional wrinkle that there's the options in these bandits are represented by pictures, and every once in a while they bring in a perceptually novel picture, and the animals like to choose that. And these are sort of reward histories on choice. The red, I think, is the reward history. The fringe is what the model predicts. And so the previous kind of handwritten models that we got from Vinny this seems like a little detail, but it's actually very telling. They underpredict the effect of a new novel option, and this is for a substantive reason. This is because this is a sort of claim about how exploration works in the brain, and this claim, I dare say, embarrassingly went back to a paper I wrote using this task in People, and the concept was that the value of exploring a novel option is sort of treated in common currency like the value of a reward. So there's evidence that your dopamine neurons are activated by novelty and so on. And the concept was, if the brain just treats novelty as reward by sort of initializing novel options high, then you get sort of exploration for free. But that was the model that people had used based on real claims about how this works in the brain, but it doesn't fit the data. And the reason it doesn't fit the data is because the novelty effect decays more sharply than the reward effect does. And that's why it can't satisfy both those constraints at once. And so what the model does, which is again like very simple and subtle, is it just moves the novelty onto a separate variable. And this is I'm not going to unpack this, but this is a sort of, rather than showing you the code this time, I'm showing you a sort of schematic. And that separate variable now carries the novelty and gets to learn at its own rate, and that fixes it. And meanwhile, Vinny's been recording in the brain and really does find a separate population of neurons in areas that's carrying the novelty signal separate from the reward one and vice versa. So we've sort of actually, it's managed from behavior to discover something that's also true in the brain. The other theme that we see a lot is sort of keeping track of additional statistics, augmenting its own history, and then sort of adjusting its behavior, like in this case, it's sort of softmax temperature with respect to the sort of variance of the action values. And we see that kind of thing a lot. This is sort of, again, kind of meta-learning, kind of non-stationarity in the network's behaviors or in the program's behaviors. Okay, so that is the journey and the destination. So what have we learned from this? I think a few things. So these programs, these discovered ones, really do just beat the hand-tuned baselines, really are interpretable, much more so than RNNs, basically do as well as RNNs, and also surface new ideas. I don't, to be honest, think these new ideas are like gonna light the world on fire. In fact, it's kind of surprising how close to, as I said, to the sort of status quo models it turns out the LLMs can get. And again, at some level that's great because it means it's been able to explain the data to me in my terms. I don't know if that's the only way to explain these data or if there's sort of a limitation of choices such that, and or a sort of inductive bias of the models to use models that look like the ones we expect. If this is a unique discovery, if there'll be other ways, and of course we want to apply this to neural data and so on as well. But it works. I think we don't know yet. It's clear that the LLMs are really good at exploiting deep knowledge of the domain and of every domain. But if we hit them with something new that there aren't a lot of published models on, it'll be interesting to see how it works, and that's sort of the next step. By the way, I think DeepMind is going to make this tool sort of externally exposed and is interested in finding collaborators to work with it further. So if that's you, you might want to talk to us. And the lesson, particularly of the second half of the talk, is if you can figure out what to score, the models are really good at running up that score. The hard part is figuring out what you actually want expressible as a number. I think the good news is even pretty simple proxies kind of work. So fit wasn't good enough, so we also added Halstead complexity, which is kind of a silly number from software engineering, and that was sort of good enough. So they're so good at running up scores, and scale is so useful that you don't have to have the perfect thing. You can sort of make progress. I guess another thing to say with respect to the title of my talk, this is a pretty automated process. Like at the end of the day, we got out programs that people could read that sort of answered our question. But if the goal is like people reading programs and figuring out things that they think help them understand things, there's going to be a human there because the human is the sort of audience. And so we can't really do theory achieve human understanding without humans deciding what they understand. So backing up even slightly further, this whole exercise in some sense was just an attempt to see, could we use these new tools to do new things, scaling up data, compute, models and hypotheses. Of course, lots of things that many of you work on that's going to be harder for. There's lots of data that's hard to scale up in this way. But as I say, I think actually pretty simple proxies, perhaps both on the data side and the score side, the power of scale and the power of kind of models at running up scores might mean that you don't have to do the perfect experiment. You can still do a lot of it and learn something. So I think I'll leave it at that and see if there are any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, very appreciate it. I just question about, I think it's wonderful problem. And just wondering if we can find a lot of this kind of the candidate program. So what next step? Do you think this next step would be to find the manager or governance layer to organize it, to understand
Yeah.
what is really, innovation program, what is really.
Yeah, I think one of the weaknesses, one of the many challenges of the approach is dealing with so many programs. So, we focused on the sort of Pareto frontier between two things, and we, by hand examined, 9 programs or something in each of these data sets. But it would be nice to be able to do something more systematic to really understand the space of how change in the program changes the scores. Clearly, we're not uniquely identifying a particular program. These programs are different. Although I think I should say that they're sort of independent runs, and the 600-line programs look really different. But by the time you force it to write the most compact programs, they all look kind of the same. And so I think when you put enough constraints in, you actually are sort of identifying something. But yeah.
So you mentioned you were and you might have touched on this question kind of at the end of your talk, but you mentioned you were surprised that these kind of, what it was finding converged so much to the things that people have worked kind of so hard on and spent so much time on. I was wondering if that is maybe or if you have a sense of if that's why it converged these things, because the search space might be initialized by the training data that's given.
Well, I certainly think, yeah, I mean, it's clear that the model is, and one could talk about whether this is interesting or not, the model knows all these models, right? To be clear, we initialize it with a stub. We don't actually show it our own written model, but it has probably seen something like it. Right? I'm sure it's seen something like it. But it does as well as an RNN that doesn't have any of these constraints, right? So part of the surprise might be that it's possible, and I don't think that's because we worked hard, and maybe I'm underselling the field. It's not necessarily the case that we were in a class of models that was expressive enough to actually close the gap, right? And I didn't think we were, or I thought it was going to have to move farther, and it didn't. I think we need to do other tasks. We chose this task in part because we kind of understand it, and that maybe that, I think that was a step, but we need to try things that are sort of more on the frontier. But I think you're right, Rebecca.
Yeah, my question's sort of related to that, how much what happened is related to the constraints of your task space. So you gave this particular example, which is very helpful, that what I discovered we hadn't thought of is the way that the reward value of the choice you've chosen continuously decreases your probability of continuing to choose it. And that fits the data in this task better because there's that tiny feature that has variance you were previously explaining. So that seems like a great example of how there was something in your data you missed that it could find and then explain. And also something that probably is pretty particular to this environment, right? It's not in general true that when we do the same thing and we get more reward, we become less likely to do it. And so I was wondering if that example helps us wonder how does fitting more and more and more data at this particular task make us actually less likely to find models that are robust across small variants of the task context?
Yeah, so I think actually, I think that's a good point. Maybe I didn't express as well. I actually think that example is illustrative of something that's going on that's actually probably very important, but something the way we've done these experiments was missing, which is you do a fixed experiment and you do it in 1,000 people, and what this is saying is it's people are sort of adjusting to the level of the rewards in the task, and that I think will be a very generic thing if we did lots of different tasks and force the model to fit all of them at once, and that's one of the things we're doing. So I think to the extent we want to keep working on bandits, which might not be the most ambitious thing, I think this does point to that there's a whole sort of, I think a lot of these results, what they're sort of showing us is hidden in these data sets where a monkey is playing the same game for a month. He's figured out the game and he's just sort of doing it, but you show people a game and they play it once, they're figuring out the game, and that's really part of the action. And so I think if we fit lots of games at once, this same feature will show up more generally as adjustment to the sort of statistics of the task. So I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I have a question about like the novelty of the insight we expect to extract from these automated like modeling tools. So if I recall correctly about both of these projects, so I think the insight that they receive are mostly on two different categories. On one hand, is like in the first paper, we kind of rediscover mechanisms that we think already exist and probably the LLM has data access to. For example, like we need to have recurrence in the neural network to accurately capture reinforcement strategies. And the other category is that it's very nuanced quantitative arguments that, for example, the object may not be exactly linear, or that the decay in the exploration is not exactly this shape, but actually much more flatter or much more steeper. Whereas I feel that basically the other question is that can we expect to generate more greater theoretical advances and paradigm shifts? For example, if it was the LLM was trained only on data before the Roscoe Wagner,
Yeah.
can it discover things that are fundamentally different rather than just focusing on these quantitative details?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think we don't know, and that's the limit. Again, I don't want to oversell this. We started with a simple domain because even a simple domain was extremely hard to get this working with Google scale resources. So I think we're in a position now to ask the question, right? How much of this was too easy for a network that already basically knows the answer? I don't know, but I do think we did figure stuff out that within this domain has helped us understand it, and will drive the next experiments, like I was just discussing with Rebecca and so on. So it's not. I don't want to undersell it either, but I think the real test will be what you ask: could we give it a domain that we don't have a theory of, there's not a theory of in the literature, and have it produce insights? And I don't know. But that's definitely a question. Yeah.
So I'm more my question a little bit the opposite direction. The ceilings you're showing are like 60%, and I'm wondering, like, is that a noise ceiling? And you keep referring to the RNN as sort of like, well, we're as good as that, but what's the rest of the variance about, and why are you?
Oh, yeah, I think it is. Well, so there's a couple things, but yes, I think this is a pretty stochastic domain. Like, people are stochastically switching between things, and there's only a certain amount. So the widespread view is that RNNs are universal functional approximators, and if you saturate the data and so on, you should be able to do as well as you can do. We think we're in that regime, at least with some of these data sets, and the rest is in some sense noise or non. The RNN is even capable of picking up, through in context learning, sort of non-stationarities of various sorts and stuff. So. This is not a domain where you can make 100% prediction what the subject's going to choose on every time. There's randomness. There's sort of irreducible randomness.
You have that on the plot, so that's not reproducible variance in the human subject pool that you can't predict.
That's what everyone thinks, and I think if you do sort of RNN fits with different amounts of data and cross-validating all the parameters and stuff.
Same noise ceiling because these are online trials. Like, you can't say how well does this person fit by the split half correlation or held that.
Yeah. So I guess another thing to say is that the cross-validation strategies here are pretty complicated, right? So so what we have in most of these data sets is multiple separate games with the same subjects, and so the strategy is fit the subjects on part of the data and test them on the other part. But again, the RNNs can sort of adjust in context, even if they, people do often. So I guess I'm used to this domain where changing by 1% is a PhD, and what can I say? Or it was until we rolled out the technology to do it automatically, and now it's not a PhD, I hope. But I think there really is irreducible noise in the way we framed the problem as a prediction problem. But yeah.
So you hinted at this in the talk that there's like a rational way to think about these extra nuances that the LLM is discovering, and this may just reflect my naivete with respect to the domain, but like what would happen if you just asked it to maximize reward?
Oh.
Come up with a program with a maximize reward. Will you converge on with a simplicity constraint? Would you converge on the same program?
I don't know. I think not. So an interesting thing is you could run any of these techniques in sort of RL mode or supervised mode. And I don't think, I mean, people have made a lot of claims in these types of domains about sort of directional effects that are rational, like people learn faster when things are changing faster, but their learning rates are not well calibrated to sort of Bayes optimal in general, I would say. So, so there's a sort of whole other program of automatic theory construction, which is design an ideal observer model or perhaps a resource-constrained ideal observer model, as you say. And my impression is that doesn't, in these particular tasks, in the details, doesn't quantitatively relate very well to people, which is why this is being done in supervised mode. But that is an interesting, we have certainly played around with both types of optimization, and other people have as well. And again, I think there are rational-ish, a lot of the work in this area has been getting qualitatively to directional predictions from rational models and seeing that people and animals comply, but they're not that impressive quantitatively.
Maybe let's just take one more question and then we can further interact out in the session.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious about the language model component in the algorithm model system. You mentioned that like new ones work well, but newer ones don't work as well. Due to they make too complicated programs. So I guess I have sort of two smaller questions about it. First one is there any pattern you find in the kinds of language models that do work the best for this? Something like architectural, or like how to represent the programs in their latent space or something? And then two, are you fine-tuning the models at all based on this scoring output?
Yeah, so good questions. So no, we're not doing any fine-tuning. These are sort of off the shelf. And I wouldn't say that we have, so overall I think newer models are better. We haven't done all the right experiments to ask in any detail what's the best model for this particular domain. I think the particular thing I mentioned, I should say, two things changed at once. We changed from Gemini 1 to Gemini 2.5, and we changed from fun search to alpha evolve, so the harness changed as well, basically, and it changed in a way that might be driving the problem. The problem was fun search requires the model to spit out the entire working piece of code de novo or copy it from its input, whereas AlphaEvolve takes a patch. And so in general, AlphaEvolve, one of the strengths in the paper they said over fun search was that it's able to work with larger code bases because it can just produce patches and not reproduce the entire thing. And so I think that's a big reason why it was able to produce much longer programs. So I don't mean to blame it too much on the language model. Overall, I think the newer language models do better. They're smarter, and this is 2.5. We were using Flash because just to save GPU, except for the very last rewrite, we used 2.5 Pro, which is nobody knows what that really means, I think. But a small model and a big model in that family, and I'm sure that the newer models would do even better. All right, thanks.